What really happened at the Battle of Bunker Hill? Picture this: one small hill, a fort built overnight, and a British army so confident they marched straight up toward it in broad daylight in tight formation, wearing bright red coats, while people and muskets were waiting behind a wall of dirt. That went about as well as you would think. This is the battle Britain technically won, and instantly regretted. And here's the twist: the Battle of Bunker Hill was not really fought on Bunker Hill, it was mostly fought on Breed's Hill, which means one of the most famous battles in American history is basically named after the wrong hill. So, what actually happened? Why did Britain win the ground but lose the point? And how did one messy, brutal fight outside Boston prove that this rebellion was not going to be easy to crush? To understand Bunker Hill, we need to rewind to the spring of 1775. 2 months earlier, colonial militia and British troops had already fought at Lexington and conquered. That was the moment the conflict turned from angry speeches and protests into actual gunfire. After that, thousands of armed colonists surrounded Boston. Boston was the key city in Massachusetts. The British controlled the city itself. The colonists controlled most of the land around it. That left the British army trapped inside Boston, surrounded by angry farmers, militia, and local soldiers who were not going home. Boston's geography made this even worse. At the time, Boston was almost like an island, connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land. Around it were hills and high ground. In war, high ground matters a lot. If the colonists could put cannons or defenses on the hills around Boston, they could threaten the city, the harbor, and the British ships sitting in the water. For the British, this was not just a minor inconvenience, this was a giant red warning light. The longer the colonists controlled the land around Boston, the worse the British position became. Something had happened. On the night of June 16, 1775, something did happen. The colonial commanders decided to fortify the hills on the Charleston Peninsula, just north of Boston. The original target was Bunker Hill. That was the higher hill, further back from the water. The colonists ended up building their main defensive position on Breed's Hill instead. Breed's Hill was lower, but it was closer to Boston. That made it more threatening to the British. It also made it more dangerous for the colonists. Now they were building a fort almost directly in front of the British Army and Navy. This was not exactly a quiet neighborhood project. This was more like sneaking into your enemy's front yard at midnight and building a problem. The officer leading the work was Colonel William Prescott. He and his men moved onto the hill under the cover of darkness. No heavy equipment and no modern machinery, just men with shovels, picks, dirt, and a very serious deadline. By morning, they had built a rough dirt fort called a redoubt. It was not fancy, it was not pretty, still, it was there. From the British side, that was the terrifying part. When the British went to sleep, the hill was empty. When they woke up, it was a fort staring back at them. On the colonial side, William Prescott was the main officer actually holding a position at Breed's Hill. He was the kind of guy who did not need a dramatic speech every 5 minutes. His job was simple: hold the hill. Israel Putnam was also involved in the broader defense and is one of the names closely tied to the battle. Then there was Dr. Joseph Warren. Warren is one of the most respected Patriot leaders in Boston. He was a doctor, a political leader, and by this point, a major figure in the resistance. Technically, he had a high rank. At the battlefield, though, he did not take command. He fought as a volunteer. Basically, he showed up and said, "I'm not here for the title, I'm here for the fight." On the British side, General Thomas Gage was the commander in Boston. The attack itself would be led by General William Howe. Howe had professional soldiers. He had more experience, he had naval support, he had artillery. On paper, this should not have been close. The British Army is one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The colonial militia was a mixed group of local fighters, many with limited training, limited supplies, and a very serious ammunition problem. Except battles are not fought on paper. They're fought on hills, in heat, smoke, confusion, and bad decisions. When the British woke up, they saw the fort on Breed's Hill. They had a few options. They could try to surround it, they could land behind the colonists and cut them off, they could wait and use artillery, or they could do the most British Army thing imaginable for this moment: march straight at it. To be fair, this was not random stupidity. European armies often fought in tight formations. Those formations helped commanders control troops, concentrate firepower, and keep soldiers organized in chaos. The British, though, were attacking uphill, across exposed ground, toward defenders, behind earthworks. This is not ideal. Before the infantry could attack, British ships and artillery opened fire. Cannonballs slammed into the hill. Smoke filled the air. The message was clear. The British were coming. Dirt is annoying. Dirt does not panic. Dirt does not shatter like wood. A dirt wall can absorb a lot of punishment. The redoubt stayed there, damaged, loud, and terrifying to stand behind, still there. Meanwhile, the colonists were preparing. They did not have aimless ammunition. They cannot afford to shoot too early. This is where the famous line comes from. Do not fire until you see the white of their eyes. Where those exact words are said, exactly that way is debated. Either way, the idea was real. Hold your fire. Wait, let them get close, and make every shot count. That's easy to say. Much harder to do with a professional army marching towards you with bayonets. The British formed up and began their first attack. Imagine standing behind a dirt wall, gripping a musket, watching hundreds of red-coated soldiers move towards you. Drums beating, flags moving, officers shouting. The British line advances up the hill. Slowly, steadily, confidently, the colonists wait. That is the part people forget. They had to wait, not because they were calm, not because this was easy, but because if they fired too soon, they might waste their best chance. The British got closer, still closer, then finally, the colonists fired. The effect was devastating. At close range, the colonial volley tore into the British line. Soldiers fell, officers went down, the advance broke apart. The British attack collapsed before it could take the fort. For the colonists, this was proof that the plan could work. For the British, this was a very loud reminder that walking uphill into musket fire is not a great hobby. Howe did not stop. He ordered a second assault. The British regrouped. Then they came again. Same hill, same exposed approach, same defenders waiting behind the earthworks. By now, the battlefield was becoming chaos. Smoke from muskets and cannons made it harder to see. The grass and wooden buildings around Charleston were burning. The air was filled with noise. Drums, gunfire, screaming, commands. Through all of that, the British soldiers advanced again. This is one of the most brutal things about 18th century warfare. Soldiers were expected to keep formation even while the men around them were falling. Modern people look at this and think, why are you standing in a line? In that era, though, discipline and formation were how armies function. The problem was that the discipline did not make you bulletproof. Again, the colonists waited. Again, they fired at close range. Again, the British line was shredded. The second attack failed. At this point, the British had a serious problem. They were professional soldiers. They were supposed to be able to push through colonial militia. Instead, they had attacked twice and been thrown back twice. The hill was still in colonial hands. British casualties were piling up. The colonists were proving something very dangerous. They might not look like a formal European army, but they could still fight. Here's where the situation changed. The colonists were running out of ammunition. This was the weakness hiding underneath their success the whole time. They had courage, they had a strong position, they had made the first two British attacks extremely costly. They did not have enough powder and shot to keep doing this forever though. First attack, ammunition low. Second attack, ammunition very low. Third attack, the ammo situation had officially become a disaster. The British still had one huge advantage: bayonets. A bayonet is basically a blade attached to the end of a musket. If you run out of ammunition and the enemy reaches your position with bayonets, the fight changes completely. It stops being a shooting battle and becomes close combat. Many colonial fighters either did not have bayonets or were not equipped like regular British troops. When Howe prepared a third attack, the British still had a chance, a bloody chance. The British attacked a third time. This time, the colonial fire was weaker. Not because the defenders suddenly lost courage, but because they were running out of ways to shoot back. The British pushed forward, step by step up the hill, through smoke, over bodies, past the places where the first two attacks had failed. This time, they reached the redoubt. Once British troops got over the wall, the defense started to collapse. Inside the fort, the fighting became brutal and close. Muskets, bayonets, clubbed weapons, panic. The colonists could not hold the position anymore. They began to retreat off the Charleston Peninsula. Retreating from a battlefield, though, is not like walking out of a bad meeting. It's dangerous and it's confusing. If the enemy catches you at the wrong moment, it can turn into a disaster. Dr. Joseph Warren stayed near the fighting and was killed during the retreat. His death hit the Patriot cause hard. Warren was not just another soldier, he was a symbol. A respected leader, someone who could have played a major role in what was to come next. Instead, he became one of the most important Patriot losses of the early war. By the end of the fighting, the British had taken the hill. On paper, they won. In reality, that is not the whole story. The British had captured the position. The Costco was shocking. They suffered around 1,000 casualties for one hill, one position, one afternoon of fighting. The colonial losses were also serious, around 450 men. The British losses were worse, though, especially because so many officers were killed or wounded. That mattered. Armies can replace muskets, they can replace uniforms, but replacing experienced officers is much harder. Yes, Britain won the battlefield. In reality, it was a terrible bargain. Imagine paying full price for a broken chair, then realizing the chair is also on fire. That was the British victory at Bunker Hill. General Howe and the British command learned that defeating the colonial rebellion would not be so simple. The colonists were not just going to scatter the moment regular soldiers appeared, they had stood their ground. They had absorbed artillery, and they had waited under pressure. They had broken 2 British assaults. They had made one of the most powerful armies in the world pay heavily for every step up that hill. For the colonial side, the battle became a morale boost. They lost the ground, they gained proof instead. Proof that the citizen soldiers could stand against the British regulars. Proof that the siege of Boston was serious. Proof that this conflict was becoming much bigger than anyone could easily control. The Battle of Bunker Hill changed how both sides saw the war. For Britain, it was a warning. This rebellion was not going to end with one clean victory. The colonists were not just an angry mob, they were becoming an army, an undersupplied army, a disorganized army, but still an army. For the colonists, Bunker Hill became a story of defiance. They could say, yes, we retreated, yes, we lost the hill, but look what it cost them. That mattered. Revolutions don't survive on perfect victories. Sometimes they survive on proof that the stronger side can bleed. Soon after, George Washington would arrive to take command of the Continental Army. The siege of Boston would continue. The rebellion would move closer and closer to a point of no return. Once you have fired on McKean's army, built forts against his troops, and killed his soldiers in battle, it gets a little awkward to go back to politely asking for a better tax policy. The road from Bunker Hill does not lead back to normal. It leads towards independence and toward a declaration that could get every single signer hanged if the rebellion failed. Britain won the hill. America won something more valuable: proof. Proof that the fight would not be short, proof that it would not be easy, and proof that this rebellion would not be crushed without a cost. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and you like history, consider subscribing. I'll be posting videos like this every single week.